Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Factory Digital Twin, or Lockheed Martin digitizes operations on manufacturing lines. I'm very excited about today's webinar, and let's kick things off. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Villedieu. I'm one of the co-founders of Linkurious, and today I will be joined by Travis. Travis, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, my name is Travis Jefferies. I'm a staff AI research engineer at Lockheed Martin.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and start the webinar. First, a quick word about Linkurious. The company itself was founded in 2013. Right now, we have one office in France, one in the US. We are a team of 50 plus employees, and we are serving ballpark 4,000 analysts throughout the world that are using Neo4j on a daily basis to conduct investigations around complex connected data, aka graph data. So you can see some of our key partners. We are working closely with Neo4j or Microsoft, for example, and we have 100 plus clients for the world. Among them are Zurich Insurance, His Majesty's Revenues in Customs, Pioneer, Dun & Bradstreet, RIA, Airbus, but also Lockheed, which we'll have the pleasure to discuss more today. So this is the agenda for today's session. First, we'll talk a little bit about graphs in manufacturing in general. And then we'll do a deep dive into Lockheed Martin experience in digitizing operations with graph and Neo4j. We'll talk about LAAC, the catalyst problem, the solution with a demo, and the impact of that solution. And afterwards, we have time, hopefully, for a bit of a Q&A. So feel free to ask away your questions in the chat section. So let's get started. So in manufacturing, there are many important aspects to master to be efficient. There are products. These products have components. There are suppliers, clients, people, raw materials, processes, machines, and of course, all of this data is inherently highly connected. So it's very much a field, a domain where there are lots of networks. And since there are connected data, there's also a lot of use cases for making sense of this connected data. So among others, there's cybersecurity and software BOM, understanding how a particular piece of software is connected to other pieces of software. And that's very important to be able to identify potential vulnerabilities, for example. There are also issues related to customer 360 and understanding for a given client, everything that this client is connected to. There are also, root cause analysis is also a big use case. You are encountering an issue in your manufacturing process. You want to know what's the root cause of that to effectively tackle the problem. There are also supply chain risks, and with COVID, we've heard a lot about that. And understanding the companies that are part of your supply chain can help identify bottlenecks, risks, and address them to protect yourself against risks. We'll talk later about PLM, so I'm not going to dive much into that. And I would just mention digital twins, BOM, everything that goes into a product that's very much a network, a graph problem, and understanding that can be key to really effectively manage your digital twins. So there are really a lot of use cases related to graph and Neo4j in manufacturing. And with that in mind, I would like to pass the baton to Travis.
All right, thank you, John. So I'm going to be running through this presentation today. We call this the Factory Digital Twin. As I mentioned in the intro, my name is Travis Jefferies. I'm representing the Lockheed Artificial Intelligence Center, or the LAKE for short. where I'm a staff AI research engineer on a AI consulting team. Before I dive into the presentation, I'm going to spend a slide or two talking about the Lake organization and kind of what we're up to. So really, our mission in the Lake is to transform Lockheed Martin by applying AI across the board. So we're doing this in three main focus areas. One, we're doing it across the enterprise, where we're using things like HR talent match to automatically match a candidate who uploads their resume to a job requisition that we think they would be a good fit for. Two, in operations, that's where this kind of product falls under, where we're building digital twins and applying AI to enable the factory of the future. Three, across mission systems. So if we zoom out and we think about the defense industry a little bit, most of the problems involve a large volume of data, a quick decision. The time to the decision is very critical. There's typically a lot of uncertainty involved. AI is not a magic bullet, but we found it's an effective tool to handle these three scenarios, which encompasses most of the use cases that we work in the defense industry. And that's really to an aid in decision superiority. In summary, we're applying the best of breed in commercial technology to the defense domain. As I mentioned on the last slide, this product was developed under the operations umbrella in a program that we called AI scheduling. So the purpose of AI scheduling was to build an application kind of analogous to Waze for the factory floor. So taking disparate data sources, meshing all that information together, and coming up with an optimized build plan sequence that workers on the factory can go operate to. Part of this effort was basically creating an AI-enabled digital twin. So doing things like asset mapping, seeing where your assets are in the factory at any given time, and trying to optimize workflows. So this presentation comes with a disclaimer. This is a real product that Lockheed Martin manufactures. It's a real precedence network. All of the properties have been federated, and some of the labels have also been federated. For those who don't know, federated is just a fancy word for fake. So this presentation, the demo portion of it uses fake data. Before we dive into the demo, it helps to understand the problem that was the catalyst for the creation of this product. So if we look at shop floor management, when they come in the morning and they have to schedule employees to work certain tasks, they had all these different systems of record. So they had one system where they would go to actually get the precedence. So that's this task has to be completed before that task. They had a different system of record they would go to get the details of the build out of what we call a manufacturing execution system. So these are things like when specific tasks opened or closed, which tasks are currently in work, and who's currently working those tasks. They had a different system to do their crew planning. So that is, actually assigning a mechanic to work a particular task. And they had two different systems to manage what we call constraints. So constraints are things that slow the build down. These are things like quality issues, or if there's a part shortage, they don't have a part on the shelf to actually do a specific task. So what we noticed is with all these different systems of record, you had all these different interfaces that have been developed over the years. And all these different interfaces led to a lot of cognitive load. Because of this, they spent most of their day planning and not as much of the day building. A byproduct of this is naturally you have a slower build. Slower build leads to late deliveries, and late deliveries leads to an angry customer, which we're trying to avoid. In summary, the build sequence, status, and the constraints were difficult and manual to blend together. Like most problems, they had an existing workaround. So at the beginning of the day, in each station, they would print out the precedence network and they would paste it up on this whiteboard. And they would do their crew huddle. So at the beginning of first shift, they would look at the board and they'd get the status of the build, the tasks that needed to be done that day. They'd go off, they'd do some work, they'd come back, they'd cross out the tasks that they completed on the whiteboard. Now this continued. So at the beginning of second shift would come in and they would look at the board and they would say, okay, first shift got this far into the build process. So they'd go off, they'd do some work, they'd complete some tasks. They'd also note constraints on this whiteboard. So for example, if they didn't have a part that they needed on the shelf, they would write that. So then third shift would come in. They'd look at the board. They'd say, okay, that top task, we can't do that because we don't have the material to actually do the task. So they'd go off, do some work. Maybe the part comes in. They'd come back. They'd erase it off the board. And at the beginning of the next day, this is how far they got throughout the build. So you can imagine if you were sitting here watching this whiteboard day after day, shift after shift, X's would proliferate across the board in a left to right manner as the build gets completed. Now this worked, but obviously there were some disadvantages of this workaround. For one, it used physical media, so it was easily lost or destroyed. Somebody could come by and just smudge what they had written on the whiteboard, and the progress that was being communicated to the next shift would be lost. So our project, it became clear that we should digitize this board. So this is what we built. So the interface we're looking at, this is what we would expose. This is in Linkurious. We'd build template queries. So we'd give them a drop down to look at the particular product that they were manufacturing. In this case, it's just widget 1 through 5. We'd give them a drop down to select the specific build area they were in this case, assembly. And then we gave them a drop down to isolate a particular tact. So in this case, we're going to load all the tacks. This is what it would look like for a kind of an all-up view of the build. One sec. So this is a real precedence network that we were dealing with. Now this particular view is something that somebody like a director in the build area may be interested in because it has the whole chessboard laid out for, in this case, the assembly build area. So you can see there's a lot going on. There's a lot of complexity. And we'll dive into it in the next slide. But at a high level, the nodes in this network represented individual tasks, and the edges between the nodes represented the precedence. So each edge, if you were to label it, it would be a before edge. So this task must be completed before that task. Laying it out left to right shows the sequence and the interconnectivity between all the tasks. Now, that view is useful to a build area director, but the way that the floor was working was each supervisor was really only responsible for a specific tact or a subset of tacts. So this next video I'm about to load, we're going to zoom in on the first part of that build, in this case, the first 3 tacts. The legend on the left we'll get into after we walk through the video. So again, this is the first 3 tasks. So let's pretend we're a supervisor and we're coming in first thing in the morning. The first thing I may be interested in is where are my part shortages? These are the tasks where I don't have the material on the shelf. So these parts are out of stock. I can't complete the task until we get the material in and it's available on the shelf. We can click a specific one, and using Linkurious, we can load the details pane on the left. This is a common theme throughout the whole product, is being able to view the whole board and then zoom in and look at a particular task to get more details. So the next thing I may be interested in is where are my quality issues? Because again, these are constraints that slow the build down. So I may go check the status. The ones that are in progress, I'm not as concerned about. But the ones that are with DCMA, or the Defense Contract Management Association, those are the ones that are outside of our realm of control. So this particular quality issue is in DCMA's hands, and it's holding up a completion of a downstream task. The same with the planned work. I can click on unplanned work and get details specific to that quality issue. So the next thing I may be interested in as a supervisor is where are my people currently working? What are they clocked on to right now? So we can click and we can identify instantly, where are all my mechanics working? What are they doing? Now, on the flip side, I can click assigned and I can see what are they supposed to be working? What did the supervisor from the last shift assign them to? And we found some interesting deltas when you look at the difference between what they're clocked onto and what they were assigned to work. Digging in a little bit, I may be interested in what Sally's assigned to work on this shift. I can do that by going to Assign Mechanics and selecting Sally and instantly jumping to the task that she's supposed to be doing. So this video, it's going to run on a loop. While it's running, I thought we would talk about the legend. So the legend on the left reveals the labels present in the graph. So assigned and clocked on, those gave insight into where particular employees were and what they were doing or what they were supposed to be doing. Completed is black, not started white, and started a kind of mint green. This showed the progress of the build from left to right. If you sat here and you refresh this over time, you'd expect the squares to turn from white to black, similar to how they X things out on the whiteboard. Our constraints, we used purple and orange to show. So a part shortage, we used dark purple. Quality issue, we used a light purple. And orange is what we called sequence constrained. So sequence constrained relates to the precedence of the build. So if you imagine 3 tasks, task A, task B, task C, if task A is planned to be worked before task B, and task B is planned to be worked before task C, I obviously can't start task C until task B is completed. So downstream dependencies that are being held up by a task upstream, we colored orange. Naturally, as those tasks get completed, as they switch from white to mint green to black, they no longer become sequence constrained, and we used a light gray, what we called workable, which means all upstream predecessors of the task had been completed, and this task was ready to be worked. So this slide kind of puts words on the page to what I just said. So the underlying nodes and edges, as I mentioned, that's the precedence network. We used labels to communicate state. There are 3 states present in this graph. We called those progress, workability, and activity. Styles, and were based on the labels and the properties. and properties show details. So clicking on any given task, you could see what the task identity is, the start and the finish time, who's working it or who's supposed to be working it, any constraints. And then what we noticed is there's not a lot of screen real estate in that details pane. So we found it useful to link out to other pages or APIs for longer reads. Linkurious was pretty nifty in this regard. It would render them as, hyperlinks that the user could click, and it would automatically open a new tab. So that was the design. How did we build this thing? So the ingress into Neo4j, that's the backend database we were using. It's a graph. We did the ingress using Java. We did this in a batch fashion as opposed to streaming. So we had jobs running on different cadences. We had one job that was running daily. We had another job that was running every 15 minutes. So the every 15-minute job would update the progress of the build. So our users had confidence anytime they loaded the application that the data they were looking at was fresh within 15 minutes. APOC was used exclusively in the build of this product. These are some of the modules we used. And as mentioned, we used Linkurious Enterprise as the front end that we exposed to the end users. Some of the features we used in Linkurious, we used default styles, captions, and layouts extensively. We use template queries and groups to control access. So if you think about the build, there's a lot of different areas in the build. There's supervisors within each part, within each area. So a supervisor in fabrication, for example, doesn't necessarily need to know what a supervisor in assembly is working. So we use groups, and then template queries, we would only give access to the group, that needed access to that particular area. I wanted to give a shout out to Linkurious because when we first started this project, the only default layout available was force-directed layout. And based on some feedback we gave them, they gave us a handy interface to basically switch the default layout to hierarchical left to right. This was critical to getting end user adoption because the build, the precedence network, was always laid out in a left to right fashion on the whiteboard. Having it in a force-directed layout just wouldn't make sense. So the impact of this product, we proved we could replace the board. The graph is a living data structure that updates within 15 minutes. It kind of replaces the 5 systems of record. It consolidates all that information in one place. We had 50 plus people participate in a year-long beta. And the way we deployed this product was kind of cool. We rolled out these big touch screens onto the shop floor. So the supervisors at the beginning of the shift, when they would do their morning huddle, they would basically go through the build, and they would conduct that huddle using these big touch screens. So I'm in the Lockheed Artificial Intelligence Center. We're a part of the Chief Technology Office. Our job is mainly to develop the tech and then transition it to the business area. So we successfully did that, and I'm happy to report that the business area rollout is in progress. And there's a QR code if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. All right. Are there any questions?
All right, thanks, Travis, for the presentation. So yes, let's go ahead and dive into these questions. Just as a reminder, if you haven't done so already, you can go ahead and submit those in the Q&A section. So Travis, let's start with you. There's one question here. How long did it take to build these graphs?
Yeah, so this solution, from the time we walked down to the factory floor and we saw the existing workaround that they were doing with the whiteboard, to standing out there with a touch screen on the floor, driving the graph that I just demoed. It was about 5 weeks end to end, so about a month. And I really think it speaks to the flexibility that we had working with a graph database as opposed to a traditional relational database. And it also spoke to the ease of use and how quickly our end users were able to basically learn the Linkurious front end. So about a month total.
Great. There's another question. It says, how much time has this helped you save?
So this has saved a good amount of time, because before supervisors would have to have, 4 or 5 different windows open, and new supervisors would have to learn these 4 or 5 different systems and all the quirks of working with them. This solution, we're bringing everything together in one place, and it's saved a good amount of time based on the feedback that we've gotten.
All right. There's another question. What kind of challenges have you faced during this time?
So one thing we went back and forth with the end users about was what properties we should display on each task. That that took a little bit, a few iterations to kind of iron out. I'd also say, just basic like data engineering challenges. So making sure the graph is updating at the correct cadence. So kind of like shuffling around which parts of the ETL we should run daily versus run, every 15 minutes versus at the beginning of each shift. That was a little challenging.
All right. Maybe to kind of go into that then, do you have any advice for other companies wanting to start a project such as this?
Yeah, I would say if you're thinking about doing something similar, you definitely want to have all your systems of record identified. And you want to, like, from day one, definitely try to plug whatever ETL process you're running straight into those systems of record. That would be one recommendation. The other recommendation I would say is identify the end user as quickly as possible. So in our case, there was actually a handful of supervisors, one in particular, that we kind of worked directly with. So we would push an update, and then get on the phone and talk to him, and get his feedback almost immediately. That helps. I feel like in large manufacturing orgs, sometimes the person you're presenting the product to is not necessarily the end user. And you really want to make sure you're kind of getting the information from the horse's mouth, if you will, on what's working and what's not working.
Awesome, thanks. All right, let's see, lots of questions coming in. Can you highlight the value add from Linkurious? For example, what you were not able to do with just using Neo4j?
Yeah, so the biggest one I would say is the template queries and the group access. So because that was built directly into Linkurious Enterprise, I didn't have to waste valuable development time, coding things like LDAP integration or, SSO, and then figuring out a way to restrict which parts of the graph specific users could actually access. A lot of that stuff because it's built into Linkurious Enterprise, it really kind of accelerated, how quickly we could kind of go from like just a concept to something that was more enterprise ready.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's find another question. Let's see. What kind of skill sets are required for such a project, and why Neo4j?
You definitely want to have a like lead graph developer, just somebody who kind of knows the ins and outs of the build. Really it's more the ETL piece of it. You want to have people who have easy access to the users too. So people who can actually go down and talk to real people, and hopefully they're co-located in the same place and they can get that feedback. And then I think in hindsight, it probably would have been useful to have more like a scrum master. So kind of that bridge between the people who are collecting feedback and the developer, and, being able, just somebody to kind of conduct the madness, if you will, and like prioritize which things go into this release versus getting rolled into next release, for example. I would say those are like the three main skill sets you definitely want to have on a team.
All right, thanks. Let's see, here's another one. What are other ways you consume the information within the graph? This edge and nodes view is great, but a lot to consume. Is there alerting, aggregation, and analytics?
Yeah, so Linkurious has alerting built in. We kind of got into that a little bit. I don't think we really matured that part of the solution as much as we could have. But you can imagine like the constraints I was talking through. If a quality issue kind of pops up in the middle of a shift randomly, that's kind of like a pattern, a subgraph that you could tease out with a query and throw into a queue for somebody to go disposition. And Linkurious Alerts has a lot of the management, kind of like life cycle management around each one of those cases, if you will, just kind of built into the tool. Reporting and aggregation. So where I don't think we matured this part of the solution as much as we could have either. But when you have the whole precedence network drawn out like that in a graph, being able to look at downstream impacts of a particular, constraint, like to do that in a relational database, it's a really expensive query because you're kind of like traversing like all the downstream dependencies. So, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity in that space to say, what's the impact? Like, is one particular constraint, like a part shortage or a quality issue, more impactful to my build than another one, for example?
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's another question. So could you use the data model to simulate parts not available or sequence constraints to identify critical points of failure and identify workarounds?
Yes. So I think this was a really powerful kind of byproduct of getting this information in the graph is once it's in, a database like that, you could snapshot the build basically So you could literally take a snapshot of the picture of the world and almost build out like states. And then, you know, once you have those kind of states snapshotted from a real build, I feel like that makes building something like a simulation a lot easier, because you can almost step through, you know, how, like, here's what it was this morning, this issue happened, here's what it was this afternoon, here's what it was a day after, or whenever we cleared the issue. The other nice thing is you could save states of the world. So what we found was, you know, if I'm a supervisor in like tact 1 and I have a supervisor in tact 2, if I can load the part of my build and then like save it, basically make a visualization out of it, and then I can just IM them a link, you know, the downstream supervisor. That saved a lot of real world time, because before, you know, they might have to literally go grab them and they have to go walk over to the whiteboard and like conduct that conversation, you know, versus doing it at their desk when they just send each other links. So yeah.
Perfect. All right, let's just take a few more. And there's a few for Jean too, so maybe we'll give Travis a little break. Jean, a question for you. How are other industrial companies using Linkurious Enterprise?
Sure, happy to answer that one. So I went over some of the use cases in the beginning of the presentation, but I guess the recurring ones are really around the management of the bill of material. We have clients that want to map the BOM to a graph view, and then they use that to answer questions such as what's the impact of removing this piece, if I have an issue with that component, what's the impact of that. It's very helpful to analyze the bill of material as a graph to find answers to those questions. And another big use case is really the management of the supply chain, mapping the suppliers, the components, to identify, for example, bottlenecks, suppliers that are very important and that should be monitored closely, to identify also opportunities to rationalize, because maybe there are parts that are coming from multiple suppliers. Also to monitor what competitors are doing, what's their own supply chain, and does it overlap with mine, and are there some potential issues related to that. So I would say that these are some of the use cases that we see quite a bit in manufacturing.
Great, thanks, Jean. One more for you. Can we trial Linkurious Enterprise?
Sure. You can visit linkurious.com and reach out via the contact form. You can also shoot me an email at jean@linkurious.com, and we do provide free trial licenses. So if you want to try out the software, by all means, reach out.
Great, thank you. Travis, maybe one or two more questions for you. Does every individual on assembly line have access to this data while they are building, or it's for supervisors only?
So we mainly focused on supervisors, just as part of our beta. With that said, if the application's running kind of on the touch screen, the supervisor or the mechanics could walk up to it throughout the shift and kind of check the check the status of the build.
Great. And there looks like there's one more question. So how are you updating the graph? Do you have an API that is updating the graph from your batch updates? And can you give a high level of your architecture there?
So I can't really provide much detail on the actual ETL. But, you know, it was in Java. We had scheduled kind of jobs writing to the graph. And then we had a couple scheduled jobs pulling from the graph.
All right. Okay, so it does look like that's all the time we have for today, but we do want to thank you all again for joining our webinar, and of course to Travis for the presentation. It has been recorded, so we will be sending you the recording as soon as possible. If we didn't get to your questions today, we can certainly follow up with you. And in the meantime, if you have any other questions, you can always reach back out to us. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.